And the story was fairly similar in the big picture sense here. And initially, the idea was, contiguity is necessary and sufficient. Things have to be together in time for you to associate them. So in this case, the reinforcement would have to be kind of together in time with the behavior for you to learn that association. But the idea that it's sufficient, that's the part where we have a bit of trouble. Yeah, contiguity is probably necessary most of the time. You're not going to form associations between, you producing a behavior and some response, some reinforcement in a period of days later or anything. That seems unlikely to work very well. So contiguity, yeah, it's necessary, but is it sufficient? Is that the only thing you have to have in order for an association to form? And just as with classical conditioning, when we, initially people's answer to that question was, yeah, it is the only thing you have to have. Much the same with the previous story, we decided that no, it's not. Contingency also plays a big role here. Now, what we finished up with last week was a bit of an expression of one of the very frequently cited studies that was very influential for a while, which was Skinner's superstition study with the pigeons, which, on the way he presented that data, seemed to provide pretty strong support for this idea that, yeah, contiguity is all that matters. Whatever the pigeons were doing at the time that the reinforcement happened, that was the behavior that Skinner said they started doing more and more and more often. But when other people tried to replicate that and paid a little bit more attention to what time the pigeons were happening, it turned out that did not seem to be true. Pigeons will do all kinds of things when they're sort of generally excited and slightly aroused. But when there's food in little pigeon brain, they all do the same thing. They all pack. So we now make the distinction between what we call interim behaviors, hopping around and flapping their wings and doing stuff, and the terminal behavior, which is the pigeons and food always pecking. Now, what Skinner claimed was that these pigeons were doing all these different things because what the pigeons had learned was that doing these things was what made the food appear. Now, we look at that same data now, we don't come to the same conclusion. We would say, no, that's what pigeons do when they're expecting to get fed. It doesn't, there's nothing in this data that suggests the pigeons actually think they're making the food appear. So, well, we're going to start up today is a little phenomenon that's been a rather useful one in some context. It makes the point about contingency is just as important in operating condition as it is in and classical condition. You have to learn that your behavior is making something happen. And some of you I'm sure have encountered this. If you've taken a psychopathology course, I imagine this would come up. I'm not sure what other people would do. But the phenomenon of learned helplessness. Now, this is one of the things that it's clearly a learning conditioning phenomenon, but it's been found to be pretty relevant in areas of psychopathology that I'll come back to in a few minutes. The original demonstration of this involved rats and operative chamber type devices. And the point is here that subjects will learn whether or not their behavior is affecting things. Whether or not there is any contingency between what they do and the outcomes. So, in this particular study, there's three groups. One group is not so interesting. It's kind of a necessary control condition, but we're not going to get too excited about that. But group one, we put some rats in a chamber here, and post-operative chambers, this one's designed for rats. The floor will be made out of a series of little stainless steel rods. And the rats can walk on this without, any great discomfort. There will be no fall through cracks or anything. but it does allow rat turds and so on to drop through a little tray to keep the chamber from getting too messy and so on. It also provides a handy little way to deliver shocks to the rat in the chamber. You can just hook up some electrodes to the floor, and we can basically deliver shocks through the floor of the chamber, which, unless this rat learns how to hover in midair, are going to be pretty hard to escape. So, we put our rat in here. Now, this is what we call the escapable shock. There's a little barrier in the middle of the chamber. We kind of divided the chamber into two halves here. We deliver shocks independently to one side of the chamber or the other. We can electrify the floors. So, we start delivering a shock to this rat. So we're only zapping, the right side of the chamber here. We're making this side of the floor be electrified. The rat doesn't like that. It's unpleasant to get shocked in the rat. So the rat starts hopping around and kind of freaking out like you might expect. Now, it's not going to take too long, in most cases, before eventually the rat jumps over that little barrier. And when it jumps over the barrier and lands on the other side, there's no shock on the other side. So the rat has managed to escape the nasty aversive shock stimulus. But now, because we're evil scientists, okay, we'll flip a couple switches, and now we're shocking the rat on this side of the floor. And again, it might freak out a little bit, but it will eventually it'll jump over to the other side where there is no shock now. Now, if we start switching back, we've got a computer controlling this, we've got to be sitting there pushing buttons ourselves, so that, at a regular interval, the shock switches sides. This rat will get really good at escaping. You'll see this in the rat's behavior. When the shock starts being delivered, it's not going to jump around and bounce around and freak out and yip and yell. It's just going to boom and jump over the barrier. And when you start seeing the rat do that instantly, pretty much, as soon as you start shocking, okay, it's learned how to escape this. Now, if you deliver these shocks on a regular sort of schedule, the rat can even do better than that. The rat can eventually, it'll learn to avoid most of the shocks. If we're like, every 30 seconds the shock's coming on one side or the other, you see the rat hang over here on the safe side for about 20 seconds, and then it'll kind of just jump over the wall. It'll start jumping over before it even gets shocked. It's learning to not just escape the nasty stimulus, it will learn to avoid it. Now, anyway, that's a bit more than you need to know here. But anyway, this rat will quickly learn what it needs to do to get away from the shocks. It'll just jump over the barrier to the side of the safe. And then when that side starts being unpleasant, it'll jump over the barrier to the other side where it's safe. Now, the second group is called the inescapable shock group. Now, same apparatus, we just made the barrier bigger here so the rat can't jump over it. We start delivering shocks to the rat, it's gonna, jump around and freak out and yelp and so on. But nothing it does is gonna make this stop. It can't escape from the nasty shock. So this is our inescapable shock. And what you're gonna see eventually, and the rat will freak out for a while, just like you probably would. But eventually the rat will just kind of give up. And it'll just sort of lay there, waiting for it to stop. Which I guess makes sense, because there's nothing the rat does to change this. Yeah, we have a third group. We don't care so much about this group. But this group is just a control group to make sure there's no funny effects of just being confined to this apparatus. So these ones, we just stick them in there and lock them in for a while, but we don't give them any shocks. And for the most part, we don't really care about that group. They do show that there's nothing special about being confined to this apparatus that's influenced the behavior. Now, after we do that sort of phase 1 training, we then go into our conditioning phase, our second. Now, here, for the rats in the escapable shock group, nothing has changed. This is just the same shit they were dealing with before. They they start getting shocks on one side, so they jump over the barrier to the other side. Now, group 3, they never even had any shocks before. They were just our sort of, the apparatus of that control group. We started giving them shocks now. They will learn very quickly what group 1 already knows. You've got to jump over the barrier. The learning helplessness thing comes into group 2. The ones that were exposed to inescapable shocks initially. We now put them back in this chamber with a little small barrier that they can easily jump over. And they don't. They don't even try. You start shocking them, and they just lay there and suck it up. They don't make any attempt to escape. Now, why would they not attempt to escape when they can? Well, as I may have already said, particularly among the various age children you may produce at some point in your life, they're going to learn something. It's just a question of what they're going to learn. And what group 2 learned here, and this is our big sort of contingency argument, because in phase 1, when nothing they did to change things, that's what they learned. They learned that when bad shit happens, there's nothing I can do about it. When these shocks start being delivered, there's nothing I can do, so just sit here and suck it up, wait for it to stop. And now you put them in a situation where there is something they can do about it. They can just jump over this little barrier. They don't. It's not because they're stupid. It's not because, they're incapable of learning. They have already learned what is relevant to them in this situation. They have learned that there is nothing you can do to escape electric shocks. So even when you put them in a situation where they can escape, they don't even try. Because they have learned that nothing they do has any contingency on the delivery of shocks. Nothing they do affects whether or not they get a shock. So later on, when you put them in a situation where there is something they can do, they don't try. It's not because they're dumb, it's because they have learned that nothing they do matters. Now, you can probably see how this can translate in as a sort of a useful idea to various aspects of psychopathology, particularly depression, which is where this idea has been most usefully applied. The sad reality of life on this planet is that bad shit is going to happen to you. It's unavoidable. You're now. So, you're going to have to deal with that. Now, there are going to be some bad things that happen to you, things that are very unpleasant, but there is nothing you can do about it. That's just one of the sad realities of life on Earth. There are also going to be bad things that happen to you that you could do something about to make less bad. And I can never remember the exact wording, but some old relative of mine had this little beautiful proverb up on the wall somewhere. It was something along the lines of, Lord, grant me the courage to change the things I can, and fortitude to stand to things I can't change, and the important part, and the wisdom to know the difference. So there are going to be bad things that happen to you that there is nothing you can do about, and in that case, the logical response is, sit there and suck it up, wait for it to stop. Nothing you do is going to change it. But if you are exposed, as unfortunately lots of people are, just due to, nothing that's necessarily your fault, but just happen to live in shitty circumstances, and you are exposed to a lot of uncontrollable aversive events, things that you actually can't do anything to change. If you get exposed to too much of that, sort of a big dose, you learn. And what you learn is when bad things happen, there's nothing I can do about it. So you don't try. And this can be a big problem for people. This can certainly contribute to depression when they go, nothing I do works, everybody hates me, nobody likes me, I'm not even going to try. Now, sometimes, there is no point fighting against certain problems, but if you treat every bad thing that happens to you as unsolvable and uncontrollable, you're just going to lay there and suck it up, you're going to have a shitty life. And this is, using this idea in the psychopathology context is, again, trying to get people to start making the distinction between bad things you have to just suffer through and bad things that you could actually do something to change. And if you get people to start actually changing some of the things they can, well, that's going to make their life better than it was before. But just like with the rats in here, people can learn with enough exposure to uncontrollable aversive events that there's nothing I can do to stop this. And once you learn that, well, that's going to determine your behavior. You're not going to try to do anything to stop it when bad things happen. So that's the idea of learned helplessness. And again, it's a pretty strong argument that contingency matters. Because what group 2 here is experiencing is they're getting a lot of training telling them that there's no contingency between anything you do and electric shocks. And that's what they learn. So nothing they do is going to affect shocks. They won't do anything. They just sit there and wait for it to stop. So this is often, this is probably the most, quote unquote classic study that is often used to make the point that contingency is just as important in terms of associating your behavior with various consequences as it is when it comes to associating two stimuli that appear together. Now, any questions about that before I kind of shift gears here a little bit? Yes, sir.
Is that the first time exactly therapy? The idea that you're trying to distinguish between changing or when knowing when to change and when to stay when to stay.
I gotta say, I am not particularly familiar with dialectical behavior therapy, but it sounds like it. Yes, I mean, the whole idea of dialectic reasoning is that you don't have all the information. So you've got to go with whatever information you have. So you kind of, here's the pros, here's the cons. You look at the list on balance and decide what you're going to do. So yeah, part of that would presumably be, learning to distinguish the things you can do something about from the things you can't do anything about. And yeah, very similar idea if I'm interpreting the idea correctly. All right, so where I want to move now is to talk a little bit about schedules of reinforcement, which can have a very powerful effect on behavior, as you'll see, and I'll tell you one of my favorite conditioning stories that makes me smile. Now, so far, and I'm not already giving the odd hint, it doesn't always have to be this way, but we've been kind of talking about a situation where the relationship between the responses and the reinforcement is kind of a one-to-one thing. You push the lever one time, you get a piece of food. You push the lever another time, you get another piece of food. It does not have to be that kind of one-to-one ratio. And there are a number of different, what we call schedules of reinforcement, which will often produce fairly distinctly different patterns of behavior. Now, the way, again, sort of the default idea that we've been kind of playing with is, one way to describe that, CRF, just a continuous reinforcement. Basically, every response you make gets the reinforcement. Now, another way to describe that would be, it's an FR1 schedule. It stands for fixed ratio 1. And the ratio here is the ratio of number of responses you make to reinforcers you get. Well, you have to make one response for each reinforcement on continuous reinforcement. So every time you press the lever, you get a piece of food. Now, as I probably indicated last week, I would love to have real rats to demonstrate some of this stuff with and have you working with rats. And if we had such a thing, the first thing you would have to do is some of the stuff we talked about last week, the whole shaping, magazine training stuff. Teaching your rat to press a lever in order to get pieces of food. Well, through that whole process, you're going to have that rat basically on a continuous reinforcement schedule. Anytime that rat presses a lever, a piece of food is going to be delivered. Now, once you got the rat reliably producing that behavior, I'll probably say, okay, well now we got to go to the next game, which is we're going to try and institute some different schedules of behavior here. And we're only going to, well, we're mostly going to talk about the simple schedules. So we'll start out with ratio schedules. Now, we've got two kinds. The first one is what we call a fixed ratio schedule. But ratio schedules are all of them numbered. And we'll see there's an alternative. So, in a ratio schedule, it's all about the number of responses you produce, and this will make a little bit more sense later. When you produce them doesn't matter. So, again, if you get a reinforcer every time you produce the response, you're on continuous reinforcement. We call that a fixed ratio 1, or FR1 schedule. One response, one reinforcer. Now, so if we were working with actual rats and you got to the point where you got your rat reliably pressing the lever to get pellets of food, what I tell you to do next is, okay, now you got to get your rat to respond on an FR2 schedule, which now means you got to press the lever twice to get the piece of food. And that's not going to be that hard a jump for the rat to make. I mean, it's already pressing levers. It's already got most of the shit figured out here. And eventually, you know, it's going to pick this up and realize it's got to press the lever twice to get the piece of food now. And I'm not sure I've introduced this little bit of terminology, just in case this is confusing anybody. This sort of SR, that's a standard little bit of terminology that indicates a reinforcer. It's like reinforcing stimulus. So if you see that cropping up, that's a little SR thing. That refers to the reinforcer. Yeah, you might not want to make this jump all at once, but I could get you, eventually, a couple steps in between, you get your rat working on an FR10 schedule. You got to press that lever 10 times to get a piece of food. Or, again, just to re-emphasize the equivalence here, if you're getting a reinforcer every time you make the response, well, that would be what you call either continuous reinforcement or a fixed ratio 1 schedule. One response gets a reinforcer. Now, what makes these fixed ratio schedules is that that number does not change. If it took 5 lever presses to get this piece of food, it's going to take 5 to get the next one, and 5 to get the one after that, and 5. And everyone's going to take the same number of presses. That ratio is fixed. Now, we talked a little bit about the cumulative record. So this is kind of a cumulative record illustration here that I'm going to show you, mapping the responses as they occur over time. And I'm kind of exaggerating some of the features here, just to make it more visible. Now the little blue ticks, I think this shows up at some point if I push the button a couple more times. Each little blue tick indicates the delivery of a reinforcer. And what we see typically in behavior with a fixed ratio schedule is what we call a step function. Now, if you remember the idea of the cumulative record, the steeper the slope, the faster the rate of responding. So what you're looking at here with this step function is a subject that's responding at a fairly high rate until it gets the reinforcer, and then it stops. There's a period of it's not responding at all. And then it decides it wants another one, and it goes over and starts banging away at the lever until it gets another one, and then it stops, and so on. So you get this step function where there's these alternating periods of a pretty high rate of responding, and then no responding. Now, those little periods of time where the subject seems to be not responding, we call those the post-reinforcement pauses, PRPs. Now, one of the things, there are limits. I mean, if you were a rat, and I had you in an operant chamber, yeah, you'll certainly press the lever one time to get a piece of this special food we use, which is basically the same as the normal food, except it's got like a whole ass load of sugar packed into it, so they like it a whole lot better. And sometimes nice flavors too. We had some chocolate flavored ones. It actually kind of tasted like chocolate. I ate it too. You get hungry in the lab late at night, long walk to the cafeteria. So yeah, I ate some chocolate flavored rat food. If you've ever had a dog and you ever buy milk bones for your dog, try eating a milk bone. It's not poisonous, it just kind of doesn't taste like, it tastes like, compressed sawdust or something. Well, that's what rat food tastes like too. But compressed sugary chocolate sawdust, and it starts tasting like breakfast cereal. So these rats, they work really hard, they get the reinforcer, they stop for a while. And then they work real fast to get the reinforcer and they stop for a while. There are these post-reinforcement pauses. Now, if you're the rat in the chamber, yeah, you're going to learn pretty quickly. Pushing the lever once to get a piece of this delicious food, that's going to seem like a pretty good deal. You're going to do that, no problem. Pushing 10 times to get that piece of food, yeah, you'll probably do that too. But you got to imagine that at some point, if I keep raising the requirement, I keep raising the number of presses you got to perform to get this piece of food, at some point, it's not going to be as good a deal for you anymore. Now, you got to press the lever 200 times to get that piece of food. Are you going to do that? Probably not, would be my guess. Now, if we start increasing that fixed ratio, we're going to start seeing generally longer post-reinforcement pauses. And this is what we call ratio strain. As that fixed ratio starts to get up there, and we start getting into the territory where if you were to put yourself in that little rat's head, it starts to become questionable about, is this worth it or not? So as it gets harder, as it requires more and more responding to get the reinforcer, we start to see longer post-reinforcement pauses. And if we keep going, eventually we get to what we call the break point. The point at which the subject decides, fuck it, this is not worth it anymore. I'm not pressing that lever 200 times to get a piece of food. And they just stop responding. So you can't get an infinite amount of responses out of the subject for a given reinforcer. There's only so much they're going to be willing to do for it. So at some point, you can just keep increasing that ratio until you find out where that is. Okay, well, now you know what the maximum number of responses you can get out of that subject for that particular reinforcer is. Now, the other kind of ratio schedule is the variable ratio schedule. So again, it's a ratio schedule. What matters is the number of responses you produce. That's what's going to get you the reinforcement. But here, that number is going to change from one reinforcer to the next. Now, it's going to have a predetermined long-term average. I'm going to decide and program the equipment to work this way beforehand. I'm going to say, on average, every 10th lever press is going to get reinforced. So at the end of your little hour-long session or whatever that you're in there, yeah, the average number of times, average number of responses it took to get the reinforcer was 10. But from one reinforcer to the next, that number is going to change. You might have to press the lever 4 times to get this one, and 15 times to get the next one, and 7 times to get the one after that, and 12 times to get the one after that. These numbers are all going to average to 10 at the end of the day. But unlike the fixed ratio, and this explains a good bit about the kind of behavior pattern we see, the fixed ratio gets very predictable. You got a pretty solid idea of how many responses you need to make to get the reinforcer. And what we see is when the subject decides they want a reinforcer, they head on over to that manipulandum and basically bang out that required number of responses as fast as they can. And then they get the reinforcer. Now, in a variable ratio schedule, it's not predictable how many times you're going to have to push that lever to get the reinforcer. So we see a somewhat different pattern of behavior. So, again, on average, it's going to take, in this case, 5 responses to get the reinforcer, but the actual number is going to change. It's going to vary quite a bit with a long-term average of 5. So much less predictable. And when it's less predictable, now again, you're not a dumb rat. At some level, you still know, or it's still about the number of responses. You've got to produce the right number of responses in order to get the yummy piece of food. But you don't know what that number is. Well, you're a hungry little rat. You would like to eat that food. What are you going to do in that situation? You're just going to be banging away on that lever pretty much as hard as you can. Because whatever number of responses is required, the faster you're banging on the lever, the sooner you're going to get there. You don't know when that's going to happen, but you're going to produce a pretty high, steady rate of responding. And that's what the cumulative record tends to look like. With a variable ratio schedule, we get a high, steady rate of responding. We don't see those post-reinforcement pauses anymore. We only see those in a situation where the number of responses becomes very predictable. So here, because you never know how many times you're going to have to hit it to get the next one, this tends to produce the kind of behavior where boom, 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 boom. You're producing a high, steady response rate. Now, to go back to something we talked about a long time ago, when we were talking about, measuring the effects of, an aversive stimulus in classical conditioning, that there was the problem. I mean, how do you tell the difference between a rat that is being perfectly still because it's terrified and a rat that is being perfectly still because it has no idea what's going on, doesn't know anything? Well, I tell you, we've got to set up some kind of behavioral background where we can see the behavior decrease when we present that aversive, the CS paired with the aversive stimulus. This is the way to do that. This is the way we would generally do that. We would start out by operantly conditioning our rats to push a lever at a high, steady rate. And then we could do the classical conditioning where we pair a little green light with electric shock, and then we got a rat in the chamber pressing away on the lever, and we show our green light, and we see the behavior slow down, and we can calculate our suppression ratios and figure out that our rat has in fact learned to fear the CS. Now, I'll come back to another application of this schedule in a few minutes. We'll talk about a couple others first. So, variable ratio, no post-reinforcement pauses, and a high, steady rate of responding. And this is the point I just made, the CERS, the conditioned emotional response training. That's the stuff, classical conditioning with aversive stimuli. Yes, sir?
When you say no PRPs, even if it's, is it statistically significant no PRPs, or do we still see the PRPs, but they're shorter or fewer?
Well, I mean, this is kind of a fudged little graphic that I made. I mean, there is going to be some pause in responding because the rat's going to actually go eat the food. Mm-hmm. I mean, if it wasn't eating the food, there'd be really no conditioning going on here. So yeah, there might be little micro pauses in here, but nothing like the long post-reinforcement pauses we see when that ratio is always the same. Now, the other type of schedule is an interval schedule, where what matters is not how many times you have pressed that lever. What matters is when you press that lever. So these schedules are based on time, and time that has passed since you last got a reinforcement. And again, we can have fixed and variable versions of this. So the number of responses doesn't matter. So on a fixed interval, 1 minute schedule here, that means every 1 minute, there's this sort of clock that runs, where you get you press that lever and you get a reinforcer. That clock starts counting. And for the next 1 minute, you can press on that lever all you want, nothing is going to happen. That lever won't be armed again. It won't deliver food again until that 1 minute has passed. And the first time you press that lever after the 1 minute has passed, you will get a piece of food, and then the clock starts over. So if you were, responding at peak efficiency, you could only get a reinforcer every 1 minute. So now, I'm not sure we want to worry about the limited hold idea too much, but to make sure that our subjects end up learning what we want them to learn here, sometimes we'll put a limited hold. So if I've got you on an FI 1 minute schedule here, and the 1 minute clock expires, and you still haven't pressed the lever, there might be sort of like a timeout, what we call limited hold. So you've got like 30 seconds to press that lever, or else we're just going to like scrap it and start over again. So if you just sit there not pressing levers at all, that's not going to necessarily work. We might decide you got to do it within some time limit after it becomes available. You're not going to get it. Now, when we look at the behavior that's produced on a fixed interval schedule, we see what is often referred to as the fixed interval scallop. So in some sense, it kind of looks sort of like the fixed ratio in the sense that it's not a steady rate of behavior. The rate of responding is changing at different points. But it's not the same as the step function we saw with the fixed ratio. In the fixed ratio step function, the subjects are basically alternating between two states where they're either responding as fast as they can, pretty much, or not responding at all. So you see nice straight lines going up and then flat lines, and a nice line going up and flat line. Here, I mean, again, if you think, sort of, you grasp the idea of what these cumulative records are representing, what we're seeing here is an animal that is, responding at a pretty slow rate, and the more time, now you don't have a little wristwatch on, so you don't know exactly how many seconds have passed or anything like that, but the more time passes, you're good enough at telling time to know that as more time passes, you're getting closer and closer to the time when this is actually going to produce something. And the rate of responding starts to get very, very fast, and then you get the reinforcer. And then it kind of slows, but you're not getting another one. I mean, you may not have a little rat wristwatch, but rats are good enough at learning about time. Right after you just got a reinforcer, you're not getting another one, so the response, you might throw out the odd response just in case, who knows. But you're responding at a very low rate, and the more time passes, as you get closer and closer to the interval, the rate is picking up. So that's why we're getting these little scallopy curves showing that, low rate of responding gradually increasing, and I'm sort of very much exaggerating this here, and then you get the reinforcer, and then things sort of slow back down and gradually peak again towards the next reinforcer. So a little bit different than the kind of thing we see with a fixed ratio, because again, this is not about numbers, this is about time. You only got to press the lever once to get the reinforcer. You just got to press it at the right time. The closer you get to that right time, the more lever pressing you're doing. Now, as you probably already imagined, there's also a variable version of this schedule. Where again, some amount of time has to pass before reinforcement's available, and we will determine what the long-term average value of that time is. But it's going to change from one trial to the next. You might have to wait. If we're on a variable interval 1 minute schedule, reinforcement might become available after 30 seconds, and then it might be 2 minutes after the next one. And again, at the end of the day, the average time you had to wait for reinforcement to become available will be, in this case, 30 seconds. But how many, again, we're taking away that element of predictability that we saw in the fixed version. So, you got to wait some amount of time before you can get reinforced again. You don't know how long that is. It's kind of like asking for sex. You just had some. You're not getting any more now. You're going to have to wait a while. But you don't know how long you got to wait. So, I don't know. How long do I have to wait before I ask again? I don't know. I mean, if it's fixed, if you're only getting laid on Wednesday night, well, Thursday, you're not asking very much. Monday, Tuesday, you're starting to increase your response rate. But when it's variable, when you don't know how long you're going to have to wait, you get the same kind of effect that we saw with the variable ratio. this is going to produce a pretty steady rate of responding. You don't know how long you got to wait. Now, this, a variable interval schedule, produces pretty reliably a lower rate of responding than a variable ratio scale. Anybody want to tell me why? Why would this schedule produce a lower steady rate of responding than a variable ratio schedule? Things are unpredictable in both cases. Why would you not just be banging away at the lever as fast as you can in this situation, which subjects don't do? For what? Yeah, well, we've all been there. No, they're not trying to conserve energy. I mean, why wouldn't they conserve energy in the variable ratio situation? Well, I mean, I guess they could, but there they've got to produce some number of responses to get the goodies. Here, technically, you only have to respond once to get the goodies. You just have to do it at the right time. But what this produces is a steady low rate of responding, rather than a steady high rate of responding. Why would it produce a lower rate? Yeah.
Is it because in the ratio they know that it's their behavior, the pressing that gets it, whereas here it has to do with time and not their physically pressing?
Well, it still has to do with their pressing. I mean, if they never press the lever, they're never getting any food.
Of course, but it's not directly correlated to the lever pressing.
You're kind of dancing across the surface of the idea.
Does that have to do with like the amount of times we realize that no matter how many amount of times they'll do it, that after a while, once they press like that or one activity, they'll realize they'll get rid of it?
Maybe. I'm not sure I quite understood what you were getting at, but it sounded like it's sort of in the right ballpark. Would you have some idea there?
Oh, is it just because they can get it faster?
But you don't know that, right? I mean, you don't know how many times you're going to have to press to get the next piece of food on a variable ratio schedule. And you don't know how long you're going to have to wait to get the next piece of food on this schedule. So, I guess what I'm asking is, if you didn't know how long it was going to take to get the next response reinforced, why would you not be like banging away as fast as you can so that as soon as it's available, boom, you get it? Well, there is a reason. And, well, I think the technical terminology for it is maybe a little bit obscure. Oops, sorry. So that's just me asking the question I just asked you, so that's not so exciting. But variable interval schedules differentially reinforce longer inter-response times. I haven't given you the gobbledygook version of the answer. Can you understand what this means in practical terms? Anybody translate this into sensible thinking? Think about what's going on here. The schedule is based on time. A certain amount of time has to pass before reinforcement becomes available. Now, you're the little rat in the chamber. The longer you wait before you press that lever, the more likely it is that that press is going to pay off, because more time will have passed. So the longer you wait before pressing the lever, the more likely it is that that lever will now produce a piece of food. So this is kind of, this is indirect. This is not directly what we're trying to reinforce necessarily. But one of the kind of byproducts of a variable interval schedule is that the subjects learn sort of a secondary sense that the longer you wait before you respond, the more likely that response is to be reinforced. That is not the case in a variable ratio schedule where it's all about number. And the sooner you get to that number, the sooner you get the food. And so pressing fast all the time is the best way to get to that number soonest. Here, with a VI schedule, you could, there's no reason you can't just do that, but basically you're making a whole lot more lever presses that you're going to learn will do nothing. So if I know I got to wait some amount of time, I'm just going to throw a response every once in a while just to see if it's, if it's passed But I don't need to be doing that, because the longer I wait before pressing the lever, the more likely it is it's going to pay off. Does that make sense? So that's why we see a lower rate with the VI version than we do with the VR version. Now, these schedules have, I mean, it's often much more than just an interesting or not phenomenon in the realm of conditioning. These kind of schedules are put into effect in all kinds of different areas that you might encounter. Now, well, let me ask you this question. Who has ever been in a casino? Anybody? Play slot machines? Yeah, no? What do you like, baccarat player or something? I don't know what it is. Blackjack? All right, so next time you feel like playing blackjack, just send me a check. That'll save you the trouble of going to the casino and just lose money by giving it to me. That's kind of win-win, right? Now, if you owned a casino and you want to make money, let's just think about slot machines for a minute. Now, let's think about a very simple slot machine, because the ones you'll actually see in casinos are much more complicated, and because there's all kinds of different prizes you could win, of different values that come up with different frequencies and so on. But what's going to happen in your casino if you have your slot machines paying off on a fixed ratio schedule? You know, every 10 times the little lever is pulled, the thing pays off. What's going to happen? What are the people in your casino going to do? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to stand behind you and watch you pull that lever 9 times, and then I'm going to smack you in the head and knock you off the stool and put in my one little coin on the 10th one and collect all the money and go get drunk. So you can see why, you know, having slot machines pay off on a fixed ratio is not going to work out that well. What if you had your slot machines paying off on a fixed interval schedule? You know, every hour your slot machines will be armed to pay off. What is that going to do to the behavior of your little gamblers? Yeah, everybody's just going to sit around drinking free drinks and eating cheap food until, oh, it's 5-2, and everybody goes over to the machine, puts in one coin, ka-ching, and your casino goes broke in no time. So you can't have your slot machines paying off on a fixed interval schedule either. What about a variable interval schedule? Would that work? It would kind of work, but what would the problem be? From your perspective as the owner of this casino. What kind of behavior does a variable interval schedule produce?
The amount of bets will go down after the price for a while, and then people will, I mean, it will be like a down time after every time that the machine
No,
goes.
that would be kind of what it would be like if it was on a fixed interval schedule. Everybody would want to play when, you know, the time interval was up, but then after the machines pay off,
okay.
Nobody's going to want to play for a while, right?
Mhm.
So you're not going to make money. So, but on the variable interval schedule, what's the problem?
Well, you make less money from the casino because
Yeah.
people respond.
They produce a low, steady rate of responses. And you make some money, I guess. But what you want the people at your slot machines doing is feeding their money out of their pockets and into yours at the fastest rate possible. So slot machines are basically programmed to pay off on a variable ratio schedule. It's based on the number of times the machine's been played. But the number changes. It's not always the same, or it becomes predictable, and people will start figuring it out, and they'll eat knife fights, and all kinds of nasty shit will happen. So you got to have on a variable ratio schedule. Now, this is one of my favorite little stories. You can think about this next time you go to a casino, if you go. A cousin of mine, who, when she was a bit younger, I mean, I'm the oldest of the cousins, and she's the youngest of the cousins, and there's maybe a 10-year difference in ages. But at one point, she was sort of in her mid-20s or something. She she was kind of floundering around a bit, trying to find some kind of career, trying to find some kind of job, something to do with her life and so on. And at one point, she decided they were opening up some new casino somewhere in Ontario, and she applied and she got some done. They sent her to this sort of training to work in this casino that was going to open. And the job she was trained to do was what they called a floor walker. So she wasn't like dealing the cards or working the games or anything. Now, if you've ever been to a casino, you probably don't see these guys unless there's a problem. But there are. The 300-pound gorilla guys wearing the sunglasses, they're in there. And you start causing a lot of shit, they will show up and they will fuck you up. And that's their job. But the casino, they want people to spend their money. They want people to believe that they are having a really good time handing over all of their money. So they don't want the 300-pound gorilla enforcer dudes walking around staring over everybody's shoulders, making everybody nervous, because people don't like that. So the floor walkers, they're like the first line of security. And you know what they want, and my cousin fit this bill pretty well, is nice, pleasant-looking, attractive people who can smile and who just sort of walk around watching stuff. I mean, she might answer questions and do things like this, but her job was basically to sort of to spot the problems on the floor, and if something was serious, then she'd get on her little radio and she'd call down the big gorilla guys to come and beat the shit out of somebody. But one of the things she was trying to do, and I remember this stuck with me, is one of the parts of her job is to walk up and down in the slot machine section of the casino, walk up and down between the rows of slot machines, sniffing. Why is she doing that? She's sniffing in order to detect the people who have shit their pants, rather than leave the machine and get up and go to the washroom. And apparently, this happens all the time. Now, to me, that is a powerful testament to the ability of a VR schedule of reinforcement to control your behavior. People will sit there, oh, I'm going to win, I can't go to the washroom, and they'll sit there and shit their pants while they're playing slot machines. So think about that next time you're pulling that stool up to the last person, what they were doing when they were sitting on that stool. So yes, these schedules of reinforcement do have a pretty powerful effect in terms of regulating your behavior. Now, there are some other types of simple schedules. We're not going to get into these in too much detail, but what we call response rate schedules. Where here, it's not just about time or just about number, it's about a combination of those two things. So, and I could have it work either way, and there might be circumstances under which we would want our subjects to learn either of those two things. So reinforcement could be contingent on maintaining a particular response rate for some period of time. So, on a DRH, or differential reinforcement of high rate schedule, the requirement could be you have to press this lever basically, 20 times per minute for 5 minutes in order to get the reinforcement. If your response rate falls below that, then the clock starts all over again. You've got to keep up that high response rate for some period of time. Or I can do the opposite thing. I could have differential reinforcement of low rate. Your response rate cannot go above some number of responses per minute or however you're measuring it for some period of time, and then you get the reinforcer. If you start responding too fast, clock resets, you got to start all over again. So those aren't particularly complicated. So this is the topic that I think we will knock it off when I'm finished with this, but don't get too excited because it's going to take a little while. Now, even though we're going to drastically oversimplify things to bring this into the laboratory here, it's a very relevant question when you think, in your real life, in the real world, as you perceive it, you probably have multiple options for reinforcement available to you, maybe on some very different schedules, at any given point in time. Now, I hesitate to bring this up for what will be obvious reasons, but why are you here right now? Is there nothing else you could be doing right now with your time that might provide some degree of reinforcement?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you could think of something. If you can't, then all right, we get along fine. But you often have options. You know, I could do this and get some kind of reinforcement, or I could do that and get some kind of reinforcement, maybe on different schedules and so on. What do you do in a situation where you have a choice? Well, we're going to talk about choice behavior. Put that little rat in that chamber where there's two levers. And each one pays off on a different schedule. Now, they're both variable interval schedules, and kind of by default, unless I tell you otherwise, and we're talking about this matching stuff, which is what we're going to get into, you could sort of assume it's a variable interval schedule. So it's unpredictable. It's going to produce a fairly steady rate of responses when the animal is responding. So you're the rat in this situation. Now, with a little bit of sampling here, you're going to pretty quickly figure out that one of these levers pays off more often than the other one does. You're going to get, you know, on lever A, on average, every 30 seconds you can get a reinforcer. On lever B, it's every 60 seconds on average you can get a reinforcer. Well, what are you going to do in that situation? Well, you kind of have, you know, three basic options, at least three that I'm going to discuss. So, strategy number one, we've done a little bit of a sampling and figured out that, oh, there's a difference here. One of these options pays off much more frequently than the other one. All right, I'm picking that one and forget the other one. I'm just going to figure out which one pays off the best, which is the most profitable one, and I'm just going to stick to that one. So let's say our rat, let me do some arithmetic in your head here. Let's say our rat is in this chamber for an hour, and it only responds on lever A. How many reinforcers can it get in an hour? You can get a calculator out if you really need to. Two? No, more than two.
20.
120? Sounds reasonable. You can get one every 30 seconds for an hour. Well, there's 120, 30 seconds is in an hour. So our rat could presumably get, you know, 120 reinforcers for doing this. Is that the best the rat can do here? No, because it's leaving reinforcement on the table here, isn't it? There's another 60 reinforcers that it could have got if it had, you know, that were available on lever B that this rat just ignored. Now, sometimes it might make sense to just sort of pick the best option and stick with it, but not in this case. So, if that's your strategy, just figure out which one works best and stick with that. Well, yeah, you'll do okay, I guess, but you're leaving stuff on the table here. It's missing out on another 60 reinforcers it could have got from lever B. So, strategy number two. I'm just going to alternate back and forth. Press lever A, press lever B. Lever A, lever A, lever B. I'm just going to alternate my responses across the two options. Well, this might get you all the available reinforcers. But the reality is, it's not the most efficient behavior that you could produce here. You're treating these two options as if they are of equal value, when in fact they are not. This one is the more profitable option. So spending an equal amount of time and effort on these two things, I mean, you know, are you going to do that? Is that what you would do? You've got two jobs, and you can basically choose when you want to work which job. And one job pays you $20 an hour, and the other one pays you $10 an hour. Now, You might want to do some of the $10 an hour job just to make the most money you could make that week. Maybe you can't get an infinite number of hours on your $20 a week job. But they're probably not going to say, oh, okay, I will spend an equal amount of time working at both those jobs. That's how I'm going to maximize my benefit here. No. You should probably, if you were a smart rat, you should be spending more time on the more profitable option, while at the same time not ignoring the not insubstantial rewards you could get for occasionally, at least some of the time, dabbling with the less profitable option. Brings us to strategy 3. And skipping to the punchline here, this is what we tend to do. This is what learning organisms tend to do in such situations where there is choice. They do a pretty good job, in a lot of cases, of matching the distribution of their responses, matching the distribution of their work to the distribution of reward, to the distribution of reinforcers. So the smartest rat of the bunch here is going to be the one that decides, okay, I'm going to spend, well, to again kind of skip ahead to a bit of the punchline here, this one is twice as good as this one. I'm going to spend 2 times as much time over here as I am over there. I'm going to match the distribution of my lever pressing to the availability of reinforcement. I'm going to press lever A twice as many times as I'm going to press lever B because I can get twice as much reinforcement from lever A as I get from lever B. And this is what we would call matching. Our subject is arranging its responses proportionally to the availability of reward. So, some more terminology for you, because I know how much you like this shit. Uppercase R. This is the symbol we use to represent a response. And then if we start using little subscripts, R sub A, that's a response on lever A. And R sub B would be a response on lever B. Now we use lowercase r's. Unfortunately, both response and reinforcement begin with an R. So the lowercase r's, we're talking about reinforcements. And we can use the same kind of little subscript to identify, a reinforcement obtained from option A or reinforcement obtained from option B. And even though in real life things can certainly be much more complicated, in the case of the matching stuff we're going to talk about here, the most complicated situation we're going to deal with is 2 options. So we're never going to go beyond having 2 things to choose between here. Now, these things, we'll maybe take our little break after we get through the terminology here, and then we'll come back and see how we put these things together. We will use an uppercase A to refer to the amount of reinforcement in some cases. And again, we use subscripts to indicate which option that amount of reinforcement is relevant to. And delay of reinforcement. This is another thing we can monkey around with in the context of matching. So, delay gets a little bit more complicated, as we'll see in a minute, but we've been kind of assuming by default so far that when you make the required response, you get that reinforcer immediately. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Sometimes you might have to wait for it. And the delay reflects how long you have to wait after you made the appropriate response to get the reinforcer. Now, this will make a little bit more sense when we actually start plugging numbers into things, but when we deal with delay, because it's numerically, it's kind of going in the opposite direction of something like amount. We talk about amount of reinforcement. A bigger number there means more reinforcement, which presumably you like better. We talk about delay. A bigger number there means you got to wait longer for that thing, which presumably you like less. You would rather get it sooner. So when we're dealing with delay, just because, in fact, the bigger that number is, the less desirable that situation is, we're going to use the inverse, we're going to put 1 over delay. in terms of the little formula we're going to get to here. So, the first thing we're going to need to deal with here is called the relative response rate. And I'm going to, any questions I give you, I'm going to probably set up kind of prompting you to go in a particular direction, but it really doesn't matter which way you go. You'll end up at the same place if you do the right things. In terms of, are we going to start by thinking in terms of response, lever A or lever B? Well, it doesn't really matter. We can start with either one of them. So, we've got our rat in our little choice chamber here for an hour. And during that hour, our little rat pressed lever A 250 times and pressed lever B 1,000 times. So the relative response rate for lever A, well, I'm going to start out. That's our little formula. Very similar to some other formulae we have already encountered in various places. So, responses on A divided by, the responses on A plus the responses on B, which is basically the total number of responses that were made. So the relative response rate on option A would be 250 divided by 1250.2. So relative response rate is always going to be some fraction of 1. If they made, of all the, if they only ever responded, if they put, like 1,500 responses on lever A and 0 on lever B, the relative response rate for lever A would be 1, suggesting that was the only thing they responded on. All their responses were on that option. But here it's 0.2, which says, 1 out of 5 of their responses was on lever A. The other 4 out of 5 were on lever B. Now again, you could have started out by figuring out what's the relative response rate for lever B, which just would have had slightly different arrangement of numbers, and presumably you can imagine that would have turned out to be 0.8. The two relative response rates will add up to 1. So what that tells you is, again, the sort of the proportion of responses that were directed at a particular option. So we've got a relative response rate of 0.2 for lever A. That tells us 1 out of 5, or 20% of the responses were made on lever A. And once we've figured that out, we don't even have to, not that that was particularly complicated math, but we don't even have to go through that shit again. We figured out, okay, it's 0.2 for A, the two of them got to add up to 1. So we just take 1 minus 0.2 is 0.8, and that tells us what the relative response rate has to be on the other option. So again, it doesn't matter which one you start out with, and then you just subtract that value from 1, you've got the relative response rate for the other option. I'm assuming that isn't too mysterious or mathematically obtuse for anybody. So start with either one, doesn't matter, but you're going to need to probably get both of these response rates figured out, or relative response rates. And you can do this if you're starting out with, I give you the numbers of responses made on each option, or if I gave you, the absolute response rates. And basically I told you, there were, 200 lever presses per hour on lever A, and there were, 600 lever presses per hour on lever B, or so on. You can, with that same, you can get to the same place with either of those starting points. Now, in a similar idea, on the small r side of things, we can calculate the relative reinforcement rate by doing the same thing. So if we know in our 1 hour session, you've got 15 reinforcers for pressing lever A, and you've got 60 reinforcers for pressing lever B, we can turn those into relative reinforcement rates using the same little kind of formula. of reinforcements delivered on A divided by the total number of reinforcements delivered on both A and B, and of a 15 divided by 75 equals 0.2, which, if you have a memory that works for longer than a minute and a half, you will recall was the same as the relative response rate on lever A. And when we see that, which we frequently will, that tells us that our subject is matching here. It is matching the distribution of its responses to the availability of reinforcers. 20% of the reinforcement are available on option A, and our subject devotes 20% of its responses to lever A. 80% of the reinforcement is available on lever B, and 80% of the responses get directed to lever B. So when a subject does that, we would say that subject is matching. They are behaving in the most efficient way possible to get the maximum reinforcement out of this situation. And most learning creatures are pretty good at this. We learn quickly to match the distribution of our efforts to the distribution of the rewards we get for those efforts. So, this is what we call the matching law. This is one of the very few examples in psychology. I actually ran into another one earlier today teaching an intro class. Now, you people have been through probably a lot more psychology courses than the intro class have. But I was making a point, we were talking about Weber's law. Anybody remember that one? A psychophysical thing. If you don't, I don't care. But the point I made to them, which I'll sort of reiterate here, is this might be more resonant to you because you've been around psychology a little bit longer. We don't have a lot of laws in psychology. If you were majoring in physics or chemistry, there's laws up the wazoo there. You know, laws of thermodynamics, laws of motion, laws of this, laws of that. Well, that's because they have subject matter that's a lot less, unreliable than human beings are. There's very little that we've discovered about human psychology that we feel confident saying, this is a law, this is something that always works this way. Because humans are pretty perverse, and it's pretty easy to find exceptions to almost anything we think is true about the way human beings think and behave. But this seems to be, pretty solid. Now, which is not to say that we always match our behavior to the availability of reinforcement, but we do a pretty damn good job of it, and so do most other relatively intelligent learning creatures. So, I'm going to say at this point, let's take a little 10-minute pee break, and then we'll come back and we'll maybe show you a couple little wrinkles on this formula for dealing with different situations. And then we'll maybe run through a couple of practice things. And, well, I haven't put this up yet, but what are practice matching questions that you can attempt to negotiate? And, let me think how this is going to work. At some point, if you don't have to do them, this is entirely voluntary, but if you want to confirm to yourself that you can manage to figure these kinds of things out and work through these questions, you do them, scan or email me somehow your answers, and I will email you back my answer key. Now, in some cases, there's a little bit of variability that there may be some slightly different ways to get to the right answer and so on, but I'll send you back my version of how to get to the right answer. But I'm not going to give you the answer key unless you first send me your attempts to solve these questions. And I'll tell you right now, there's a couple, there's I think maybe 4 or 5 of them, but some of them are pretty straightforward and simple. Some of them are a little bit trickier. And I'll tell you right now, some of them are trickier than anything you would expect to see on an exam. So, but I threw a couple in there that are maybe a little bit challenging just to push people to see if you can really figure out how all this stuff works. And one of the things that's going to be handy for you, I'm sure at some point somebody tried to teach all of you this equation balancing. Basic idea, you got some shit with an equal sign in the middle. As long as you do the same thing to both sides, it's still a valid equation. So we're gonna play around a little bit with that kind of stuff, to some extent, where you might have to in the context of these practice questions. But I'll get those up there sometime tomorrow when I'm posting my notes. But we'll go through a couple of examples of stuff and talk about some of the details. But let's take 10 minutes now to go do what we need to do, and then we'll carry on. Use to you, but it might come in handy. For the most part, we're going to worry about the first version, but yeah, I'm not going to. We talked about the equation balancing thing, which is going to come into play. If you're real good at equation balancing, you could turn the first one into the second one in a fairly straightforward manner. I am not very good at equation balancing, so we could sit here until 10 o'clock watching me try and figure out how to do that. I'll probably get it sometime before 10. But just so you don't have to watch that horror show, I'm going to just say, yeah, you can take my word for it if it doesn't make any mathematical sense to you. That if the first version of the matching law is true, then that simpler version, saying the ratio of responses on A to B is going to be equal to the ratio of reinforcements on A and B, should make some sort of intuitive sense to you. Now, so that version that I have there, the big R's and little R's version up the top, that's sort of the basic version of the matching law. But there's a few little variants that we can throw in there to deal with some slightly different situations. Now, if we were just dealing with if we're just dealing with a scenario where, as I described in the initial example, we've got two options that just pay off on different variable interval schedules, then this is the version of the formula that will be the most useful to you. But we also could have plenty of situations where what differs is not the VI schedules. Both options could be on the same VI schedule in terms of how frequently they're going to pay off. But what differs is how much reinforcement you get. So we could have both levers A and B on a VI 30-second schedule, but when lever A pays off, you get a single food pellet, and lever B pays off, you get 2 food pellets. So that should make lever B a more profitable option for you, which we would expect to show up in the fact that we spend more time dealing with B. So slightly different numbers here, but same idea. Well, we just substitute amount in on the reinforcement side of the formula. So we're still dealing with responses on the left, but on the right side of the equal sign, the amount of reinforcement delivered on option A divided by the total amount of reinforcement delivered on both options when they pay off is going to be equal to the equivalent relative response rate. So if you're dealing with a situation where what differs between the two options is not how frequently they pay off, but how much you get when they do pay off, then this would be the version of the formula. I mean, mechanically, the math is exactly the same. We can also deal with delay. As I suggested, there's another way we can make the two options different from each other. They could be on the same VI schedule, but when you make the appropriate response, you might have to wait some period of time before the reinforcer is delivered, and we can make that be different for two options. So both options produce a single food pellet when they pay off, but lever A, there's a 2-second delay, and lever B is a 5-second delay. Well, like most rational creatures, we don't want to wait for something if we don't have to. The longer we have to wait for that single pellet of food, basically the less valuable it is as a reinforcer. So we should see this influence the pattern of responses. And now here, again, because unlike amount, the bigger delay gets, the worse things are, we do 1 over delay. We do the inverse of delay. So in this case, we fill in the right side of our formula with 1 over the delay on option A divided by 1 over the delay on option A plus 1 over the delay on option B. And with that little added wrinkle, again, the mathematics works pretty much exactly the same way. Those two things should be equal if our subjects are matching. And we can combine the two. This is the most funky version of the formula that we have to deal with. And I'll mention this just because I'm sure this is going to come up in somebody's mind before too long. I'm going to give you all these formula on the exam paper when we have our next little exam. So memorizing all these formulas is not necessarily something you have to invest any neurons in. I will give you all 4 versions of the formula, but you're still going to have to figure out which is the right one to use in a given situation. That seems like a likely thing to have happen. So we combine amount and delay. We can sort of combine these two things to make our options different. Lever A, you get 2 pellets, but you got to wait 2 seconds for them. Lever B, you get 4 pellets, but you got to wait 3 seconds for them. So there, instead of having 1 over the delay, we'll put the amount of reinforcement over the delay of reinforcement. And fill in the right side of our equation that way. And again, once we've done that, the math is the same as it always is. Dividing and adding, and that's about as complicated as it gets. Now, I should have dug up a good entertaining video because there are some pretty entertaining ones. Studies, people, particularly developmental psychologists, are often interested in this because this is something that changes pretty drastically over the course of people's early development, is your ability to, resist impulsive behavior. I don't know, you're familiar with like the marshmallow test? You take a little kid and you put him in a room with a bowl of marshmallows and say, you can have 1 now, or if you wait 10 minutes, you can have 3. And what you find is your typical 4-year-old can't wait 3 minutes. They grab the marshmallow. Now, that would be an example of impulsive behavior because you're ending up at the end of the day with less marshmallow than you could have got because you couldn't wait for it. If you could have waited, if you could have exerted a certain amount of self-control, you would have ended up with more marshmallows. But children are notoriously bad at resisting this sort of impulsive behavior. Adults are not particularly good at it, but we tend to be a little bit better than children. We can sometimes control our impulses. So we could use this amount over delay version to examine this sort of very issue. You want 1 marshmallow right now, or do you want 10 marshmallows 10 minutes from now? Well, a rational creature, which clearly children are not, would look at that situation and say, I'm going to be way better off if I wait 10 minutes and I get 10 marshmallows. So that's what I'm going to do. Well, if you can make yourself do that, you're not being impulsive. But, looking at whether or not you're going to go for something, even if it's a shittier reward, just because you can get it sooner, well, that's kind of the definition of impulsive behavior. You choose the thing that gets you something as soon as possible, even if that ends up meaning you're going to end up getting less reinforcement. Well, typical adult rat won't do that. They will match their behavior pretty well to the availability of reinforcement. They will wait for the better thing in a lot of cases. So, maybe before we get into this, let's just try a couple of examples. Well, I'll let you work them out, and then we'll see if we need to do them en masse here. So let me give you a situation. So let's say we got lever A, and we got lever B, and this is, let's say this is we'll say, okay, 45-second BI schedule, and this will be, let's say, we'll, make it a little bit complicated. BI 75-second schedule. And total of 2,000 responses made. Question is, how many of those responses were made on Labor Day? What are you going to do to figure this out? Use the basic big R, little r version of the matching law formula. So we don't waste time going down too many of the other possible paths. Oh, I need to give you a little bit more information here. So, they're in it for a 1 hour session. That gives you some time frame to work with. While you're figuring, I'll give you a little piece of advice. Well, not so much advice as telling you how you gotta do things. When you're coming up, when you're trying to figure out answers with this particular formula, always round things off. You can't have a part of a response, you can't have a part of a reinforcer. So when you're doing the math, you might come up with some decimal pointy answers to things, just round them off to the nearest whole number. Come up with anything yet? Gestures that suggest a not complete answer. What? 4 responses? Yeah. Something's gone off the rails there. Well, what's the first thing we need to do to figure out the answer here? Oh. Here's our basic matching law formula. First thing I would want to do here is figure out, okay, how many reinforcers could they get in an hour on either of these two schedules? So, I'm not sure I can do this in my head. Well, I can do this part. many seconds are there in an hour?
3,600.
3,600. Okay, so we'll start with our, on lever A, we've got a 45-second schedule. How many 45 seconds are there in an hour? Okay, so, well, there's 80 reinforcements delivered on lever A over the course of that hour. How many 75 seconds are there in an hour? 48? All right, that sounds reasonable. So now we know how many reinforcements were delivered on option B. Now we can start plugging shit into our formula here. Well, R sub A, that's the thing we're trying to figure out. So we don't know what that is, but we do know what that is, because I told you what the total of responses was. So we know RA plus RB equals 2,000 equals reinforcers on A divided by reinforcers on A plus reinforcers on B, and then we just, I write the whole thing out again. What's 80 divided by 128? 2.63? 0.63? That more or less what everything? Okay, so let me say 0.63. So that's our relative reinforcement rate there. 0.63 or 63% of the reinforcers obtained here were obtained on lever A. And presumably, if we need to know, and that would suggest that 37% of the reinforcers were delivered on lever B. So we boiled the right side of our equation down to a single number. And here's where we just got to do some pretty basic equation balancing. What do we need to do? We need to get this on one side of the formula by itself, with the rest of the shit telling us what this equals. So the way to do that, we just multiply, if we got RA divided by 2,000, well, let's multiply both sides by 2,000. That leaves us with RA by itself, 0.63 times 2,000, and what does that equal? 1,260 responses on lever A. And presumably it wouldn't be a great challenge if I now asked, well, so how many responses were on lever B? Well, 2,000 minus that, so 740 responses on lever B. Anybody mystified how that worked? Let's try a slightly different one. Let's say we're same DI schedule on both options. Here, what's different between the two options is the amount of reinforcement you get. Again, just for some giggles, let's say it's a 1 hour session. And total of 750 responses. How many of those responses were made on lever A? 225. Right? Anybody got a different answer? I don't know that it's right or wrong. I haven't done that in my head. Anybody coming up with something different? Coming up with the same value? You got the same value? Oh, that's a vote of confidence. Well, seems like his answer worked. Well, let's run it through the mill here and see what we get. So again, this is what we're trying to figure out. We don't know that yet. We do know the total number of responses. And we know there was, 3 pellets for Weaver A, 7 pellets for Weaver B, so going that far, we can say, okay, well, our relative reinforcement rate for option A is going to be 0.3. 30% of the reinforcers were delivered on option A. Now we just got to do the same trick. We got to get RA by itself. So we just multiply both sides by 750 to get rid of that divided by 750 part. .3 times 750. I can't do in my head, but I'm willing to go with 225 if that seems reasonable to review with calculators. Anything mysterious there that we might follow? See if it's screwed up. Well, I could have just said nothing and left you to assume that these were on the same VI schedule, but I thought it would be explicit. And no, they're both on the same VI schedule. But what's different here, I mean, that's the thing you gotta ask yourself based on these questions. Okay, how are these two options different? They're not different in how often reinforcement becomes available. They're different in the amount of reinforcement you get when it pays off. So you can sort of safely ignore the VI 30-second part of things in this particular situation. Anybody want to go through a delay version of this? Or, yeah, okay. That wasn't the answer I expected. All right, we'll try one of those. I'll give you the full Monty here. So, again, I'll say we got the same schedule on both. Here on Weaver A, we get 3 pellets at a 7-second delay. And on option B, we get 2 pellets at a 6-second delay. One-hour session. Throw a little wrinkle at you here. A total of 100 reinforcers delivered during this session. How many reinforcers were delivered on option B? something? 43. Zoom rate. A little bit weird and tricky, isn't it? I'm not telling you much of the right information, so you would have to make a few little logical leaps and figure this one out. When I ask you about reinforcers, I'm not really telling you much about reinforcers here. You're going to have to start by coming up with some way to figure out, well, how many reinforcers could you have got? And so, faced with this question, which is a bit of a geeky question here, I would start out with, okay, well, how many times in 1 hour can I get those 3 pellets? Well, every 30 seconds I get 3 pellets. I guess there's 120 times 3, I could get 360 pellets over the course of the hour on a lever a day. I'm sure I can do math in my head. No, I understand. So, again, 2 pellets every 30 seconds for an hour. That does 140, I believe. And if you did that, then you would probably not use this version of the formula. Go back to using the big R, little r version of the formula. Well, you plug those in, I'm not going to go through it. I'm going to assume that that's pretty much what you did. What did you do? How did you come up with that answer?
Since they both have the item, the hour is 30 seconds.
Yep.
The number of times that you are going to do it is 400.
Yeah, they're both gonna, I mean, both would potentially pay off 120 times in the course of that hour.
So in the cases, how many actual reinforcers do you have?
Yeah. I think this is a question that you probably can't answer, given the information that I gave you. Let me change it a little bit, make it one you can answer. Now, there might be ways you get around that, but that would be a little bit tricky. A more traditional question. 1,000 total responses. How many responses remain on lever A? So now you can actually use this version of the formula. Something? I don't know. That sounds good to me at this point. I can't do this shit in my head. 760. That's what we have suggested as an answer. Anybody know different? Anybody else got the same answer? Crunch through the mathematical machinery here. All right, that's what we want to know. I know what the total number of is three pellets, 7-second delay.
I made mistakes.
Okay, all right, we'll retract that. Yes. What was the other one? 2 pellets and a 6-second delay. Now, first thing I would do at this point is get these fractions the hell out of here and convert them into some sort of decimal values. So, somebody with a calculator can inform me, what is 3 divided by 7? 2 decimal points. 143? And in general, don't worry about going beyond 2 decimal points and any sort of calculating there. And what is 2 divided by 6? Well, I can figure it out how. I get my 0.33. And 0.43 divided by 0.76, being the total. Those two values is what? 0.57. And now we just get our isolate response on A by itself. 57 times 1,000 tells us that 570 responses were made on Beaver A. All right. Well, I'm not going to go through any more examples on the board. I assume that will give you at least a bit of a roadmap if you want to try doing these practice questions that I'll put up tomorrow. Again, it's probably a fair amount of effort to actually type out your work in an email, but do your work in some sort of legible handwriting that I can read, and then just scan me a photo of it, and I will have a look at it. And as long as it looks like you attempted things, I'll send you my version of the right answers, and if there's any confusion there, we can sit down and talk about it at some point. Now, a couple other things I just want to get through, and we'll knock it off a little bit early. We'll leave out the theories of matching. We'll save those for next week. There are 3 different explanations that people have come up with about how an organism could do this. And we'll start out next week talking about that. But there's a couple of things that sometimes occur. Most organisms in a situation like this, humans, rats, pigeons, whatever, they're pretty good at matching their behavior, matching the distribution of their responses to the distribution of reinforcement. But not always. And what we would call undermatching, or a reduced sensitivity to the differences. When I was talking and when I first got into this about the 3 possible strategies that you could take in this situation, and strategy 1 was just find the most profitable option and stick to that exclusively. Strategy 2 was just alternate back and forth between the 2 options. Strategy 2 would be undermatching in a case where there actually was a difference in the payoffs. You're treating the 2 payoffs behaviorally as if they're the same by investing the same amount of time and effort in them, when the reality is they are not the same. If you were going to really match your behavior to the availability of reinforcement, you'd be responding more to the more profitable one and less to the less profitable one. So sometimes we do see undermatching. We see cases where subjects are alternating their responses basically, even when that's not the most efficient strategy. That's what we would call undermatching. Responses being more evenly distributed across the options than they should be if you're really matching your behavior to the situation. And as you might guess, there is also a phenomenon we call overmatching. strategy 1 that I described, where you just pick the most profitable option and you stick to that exclusively, well, that's extreme overmatching. We could see overmatching that wasn't that extreme, where you just spend more time on the more profitable option than is, proportional to the reinforcement you're getting. That would be a case of overmatching, where you seem to be, whereas undermatching, it's like you're not sensitive enough to the differences in reinforcement availability. Overmatching is like you're overly sensitive to the differences in reinforcer availability. You tend to spend more time on the better option than you really need to or should to efficiently get the most you can out of the situation. Let me just finish off with this particular idea. This is something we have to incorporate into a lot of matching situations. If I had you in some sort of human operant chamber thing where you got 2 buttons you can push to get reinforcement on different schedules, just like a rat in a chamber with a couple of levers, this might be a precaution I'm going to have to build into the system to make sure you don't end up learning the wrong thing. Because, as I've said, learning creatures, they will learn something. You just gotta try and make sure they learn what you want them to learn and not something else. Now, this is a technique, or a little thing we will work into the procedure in order to make sure we don't end up accidentally training our subjects to think the wrong things and do the wrong things here. So, we call it changeover delay. So, you're in your little operant chamber with the 2 buttons that you can push, and you just pushed button A and got a reinforcer. Now, button A and button B are both on, in this case, they're on different VI schedules. So you don't know for sure when they're going to pay off, but you've been in there long enough to learn that they don't pay off equally often, so one of them's a better option than the other one. But you pressed button A and you got the reinforcer. You got the chocolate chip cookie. Now, you got that because on lever A, that VI clock got to the point where it was armed and you could press the lever and get the reinforcement. Now, while you're doing that, imagine on lever B, even though it's on a different VI schedule, just coincidentally, that clock also just hit the mark. I mean, these are sort of randomly determined time periods because it's a variable. So you just got reinforced for pushing button A, and if you went over to push button B, according to the schedules in effect, that should also pay off now. But we're going to keep that from happening. If you just got a reinforcer on one option, no matter what the schedule in effect on the other option says is supposed to happen, we're going to make there be a delay. Even though legitimately, according to the way the schedules are working out, you should be able to run right over to lever B, press that one to get another reinforcer. We're not going to let that happen. This is the changeover delay. We're going to make sure, no matter what the schedule says should happen, once you get a reinforcer on lever A or button A, the next 5 seconds, no matter what the schedule says, you can't get a reinforcer on lever B. Even though it should give you a reinforcer, you're going to have to wait an extra 5 seconds to get it. And why do we do that? Well, we do that, again, as I said, to prevent undermatching. Now, can you see how this will prevent undermatching in some circumstances? And you think about, put yourself in the mind of a subject in this situation. You pressed button A, you got a cookie. You go over, you press button B, and you get a cookie. You might think, okay, that's what I got to do. I got to press button A and button B, and I get cookies all day long. So, and that would be undermatching if in fact they are on different schedules. So we put the changeover delay in there so that hopefully there is very little chance that what you learn is that you're getting reinforced for switching from one lever to the next. which you might think was what you're getting reinforced for if you got reinforced on A and then go over and immediately get reinforced on B. So even if you should be able to get a reinforcer on button B at this point, we're going to make that hold off for 5 seconds or some short period of time, just to try and make sure that you don't get the idea in your little rat head that what you're being reinforced for doing is going and switching back and forth. Because that will produce undermatching. That will produce the sort of alternating behavior across two options which are not equally valuable. Make sense in a general sort of way? Alright, I don't want to talk about this today, so this is where we're going to knock it off.